Well, I'm delighted to talk with you today about my participation in the Bannych чтениях in late May. I'm Nэнsi Collman. I'm a professor of early modern Russian history at Stanford University. For us, that means, well, for my work, that means I study the 15th through the 18th centuries, what we call Muscovy and the Petrine period, Peter the Great's time as well. Let me say a few words about my paper in the conference. The title is State Violence, which you've now heard a lot about from me, States of Exception, which is that right of the sovereign to kill, and the role of the Tsar. And what I want to talk about based on my research are those topics. My research, I published a book called Crime and Punishment. The Russian translation is indeed «Преступление и наказание» in early modern Russia. And what I did was that I studied the practice of the law in the 17th century, early 18th century, and I read hundreds of court cases of murder, robbery, assault, treason, and heresy, things like that, the highest criminal courts. And I want to talk about that and the judicial culture that Muscovy has. So I'll talk about state violence as legitimate violence, and I'll sort of show you and talk about how Russia had a very functioning, orderly legal system. And in terms of the amount of violence that was in that legal system in 17th century law, the uложение, 1669 criminal code, Russian law of the time and Russian judicial practice at the time was no more violent than its peers in Europe. And in fact, I could even argue that they're even less violent in terms of the way they executed people. But at any rate, everybody was using Roman law, France, Germany, the Netherlands, and Russia. So they're all using judicial torture. They're all using capital punishment and corporal punishment. So Russian law at the time was no more violent. And so I'll talk a bit about that kind of state violence. I'll give you a little bit of an episode from Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich when he stepped into a state of exception to use an execution in order to calm society. And then I'll talk about the history of capital punishment briefly in Russia, because Russia looks very good. It abolished capital punishment, starting with Empress Elizabeth in the 18th century and lasting through the Great Reforms, with some exceptions. So I'll talk a little bit about why the Tsars did that and what it says about Russian ideology of the Tsar. And then I want to conclude, however, by pulling back and saying, let's not get too excited here about how humanitarian Russia was, because there were other uses of state violence going on at the same time that it had an orderly judicial system with very little capital punishment. The state was also, as many of you know history, using an awful lot of violence in the borderlands. Martial law was allowed in the borderlands. A lot of capital punishment was allowed in the borderlands as they expanded into the Caucasus, as they expanded into Central Asia. So that at the same time that there's no death penalty in the heartland up around, Moscow and the major provinces, there's a lot of violence in the borderland. And we can't ignore our conference asked us to think a little bit about private violence as well as public violence, state violence. And in Russia, we had serfdom. You had serfdom, which means it's a bit of a both public and private use of violence. And we should think a little bit about how much serfdom constitutes violence within the system. And I'll say a few words about it because it's a very complex answer, because it was a complex institution. And so my talk will start with Muscovy, march us into the 19th century, and get you thinking about legitimate and illegitimate uses of violence in Russian history. Thanks. Looking forward to your participation in the conference too.